Hello, my name is Matthew Sortino and welcome to Their Stories Unbroken. Today I am speaking to Dr. Jack Lieder, a child survivor of the Holocaust. Jack was born in Brussels, Belgium in 1939 to Austrian Jewish parents, Richard and Hilda. Richard, Hilda and Jack's older brother were forced to escape Vienna in June 1938 due to multiple incidences of antisemitism and violence, culminating in the Nazi Annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss, in March 1938. The family had the intention of going to England. However, as Hilda was pregnant with Jack at the time, this already dangerous trip was made impossible, and they settled in Belgium. Jack's father was subsequently interned by Belgian authorities and sent to French internment camps. After the German invasion of Belgium and France, he was transported to Auschwitz, where he was murdered in 1942. The family, alongside Hilda's mother, who had now joined the family, were all forced into hiding. With false papers, smart decision-making, and the brave actions of various upstanders, Hilda, Jack, his brother and grandmother were all able to survive the war. They moved to Australia in 1948, where Jack fell in love with his new country and contributed beyond measure. Jack is a retired GP and is a recipient of the Order of Australia Medal. He is married to fellow child survivor of the Holocaust, Gilla, and they have two remarkable children. Jack and Gilla never cease to give back to the community and work hard to ensure the lessons they have learned from the Holocaust can inform others to ensure hate will never take over again. During our conversation, Jack shares his story with openness and grace. He shares letters and journal entries from his mother and father, recounts moments of heartache and loss, describes his first memory as a 4-year-old hidden in a cupboard, and details the lessons he learnt from his brother to help evade the suspicions of Nazi soldiers. Jack's love for his family shines through, and the way he honours his mother throughout our conversation is simply beautiful. The legacy of Hilda is one of resilience, hope, kindness, and of never giving up. After recording the episode, Jack and I discussed the racism that exists in Australia. Jack has a deep care for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and wanted to share part of a reading that he feels sums up resilience. Here is Jack doing that reading now.
Next Saturday, at the Dreamtime game, he will walk onto the MCG as this year's honoree for the Doug Nicholls round. As a 7-year-old, Sonny Morrie, while playing on the Todd River, was bundled into a car and taken away. He subsequently suffered terrible racism, called awful names while playing football. He says, "Didn't worry me. I was more determined to succeed and do better every time I was called names. I always believed I'm better than what the racists want to call me. We're all on this planet for only a short time, and if we don't care for each other, we've got a problem."
It was a joy to meet and speak to Jack. He is a true treasure, and I thank him for joining me on the podcast. If you are enjoying this podcast, please share it with your family and friends, subscribe on your podcast player of choice, and leave a review. It really helps. If you would like to get in touch, you can reach me on theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. And now, I bring you Jack Lieder. Jack, welcome to Their Stories Unbroken.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure having you. I want to start with life for your parents and even grandparents. What knowledge do you have of their life growing up and I guess their early life and then into your early life?
Yeah, well, perhaps if I talk about my grandfather, that's my maternal grandfather, I have a photo of him. This is in Austria. I have a photo of him in army uniform with medals on his chest. In fact, he has a sword hanging next to him. He fought in the First World War for Austria. He died in 1934, but, I sort of wonder what he would have thought a few years later when he saw what was happening. In fact, when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, that was a tumultuous time, and apparently he had a heart attack or a stroke, and I gather from what I've read that maybe that was part of the cause. must have been devastating for somebody who fought for the country and then find the country turning like that against the Jewish people.
What was Austria like when he was growing up, do you think, or to your knowledge?
Well, I don't really know, but Austria and Germany were really combined. But things were bad before 1933. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in the late 20s. People read it, knew what was in it, and ignored it, didn't think it could happen. And all the things that he wrote in Mein Kampf, people just didn't believe what would happen to the Jews. Well, most people probably didn't care, but they didn't believe that it could happen. And Jewish people certainly, many Jewish people didn't believe it. And I've just heard recently a friend of mine, his father was in Germany. He said, "Oh no, that can't happen. No, it's not so bad." But of course, it turned out to be bad. And 1933, when he came to power in Germany, he then proceeded, or the German government, as it was then proceeded to change the laws, and things became intolerable for Jews. But they still didn't believe it. 1935, the Nuremberg laws, it was there. Jews were prevented from going to university, or they're limited, or they weren't promoted in positions, or their positions were taken away from them and replaced by their colleagues or their henchmen. But even then, 1935, so the Nuremberg, 1936, the Berlin Olympics. When I was here in Australia, 1950-51, I had swimming lessons here through Ajax, a Jewish club here. My teacher was a lady called Lucy Gordian. She was an Austrian swimming champion in 1935. She was prevented from going to the Olympics in 1936. Jews were prevented to go. I think there were Jews amongst the American athletes. So it was just so obvious what was happening, but people ignored it. And then March 1938, Hitler marched into Austria to a great welcome, and that was the annexation of Austria into the so-called Greater German Empire. March 1938, and my parents had a leather goods shop, I think it was, and perhaps if I could read what my mother wrote. When I say what she wrote, she must have been a habit in Austria for people to write a journal or a diary to their children. And she had written one to my brother, who was born in 1927, and we have that, which is invaluable. But then she also started writing one to me, in fact, before I was born. She was writing to her unborn child. What I want to read is a small section of what she wrote, because historians usually write about an event much later. This is contemporaneous, and it's quite interesting, because things became totally intolerable after the Anschluss, almost overnight. And she writes, "Father," she means my father, "father is threatened with imprisonment by a young Nazi hooligan in our shop. One day he's beaten up in the street and comes home bruised. In fact, I believe he was made to scrub the street with a toothbrush. That we've seen those sorts of videos, but apparently that did happen to my father. Uncle Louis, that was my mother's brother, is arrested and sent to Dachau, a concentration camp. An uncle and auntie of mine are in a terrible situation, no passport and trying to get out of the country. Uncle Max is arrested on his way to work and sent to Dachau. The basis of our existence is crumbling in front of us all over the place." Quite a perceptive sort of comment to be writing down. And I've often wondered why she did and why she wrote this. And it comes through in the diary that she wanted Herbie, my brother, and me to know what things were like. So my knowledge is partly through what she's written. Anyway, in June 1938, so within 3 months of the Anschluss, my parents decided to get out, leaving behind siblings, and their 2 mothers were still around. They just wanted to get out of the place. My grandmother, my mother's mother, refused to go with them because the two sons that Mum mentions in that what I just read, the two sons had been sent to Dachau, and she wasn't going to leave without them. And this is something I don't quite understand, but both of them, and in fact the brother-in-law, she managed to be got out. So when I said my mother's brother-in-law, that was her sister's husband. So her sister and my grandmother, these two women, somehow managed to get the three boys out of Dachau. Now, I don't know whether that was through bribery or what. I think people, probably mainly men, were able to be got out on the proviso that they left the country, because the policy then was Juden raus, Jews out. And it's interesting what happened to those two boys, and perhaps we can talk about that later on. Because even before that, when I mentioned my mother's sister and her husband, they had a daughter, and she got out of Vienna on the Kindertransport. So within my family, there is the Kindertransport and other things which we'll touch on, but my family seems to touch all those major events that happened. The Kindertransport, when you think about parents sending her, I think she would have been about 5, just sending her away with the promise, I will join you. As it happened, they did. They were fortunate. But, people went through those incredible traumas.
Jack, can I ask, with your mum's letter, which is amazing to be able to have that record, what was your mum's name, what was your dad's name, and what was life like for them in Vienna before 1933, for what you know? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I have some indication of that because I have the wedding photo, and it's a beautiful photo, 1926. And, they were settled people in Vienna, and 25% of Vienna was Jewish. And they were middle-class people. I don't think they were particularly wealthy, but all the trappings of a wedding, they were settled in the country. And that was all destroyed, so I think what was life like? The anti-Semitism was clear, and the stories I've heard. For example, I remember my mother saying that, during Pesach, during Passover, they would go away and they would have their matzah, the unleavened bread, they would have it with them, and they would eat it and hide it under the park bench. An incident, and I think about this currently in what's been happening here over the last 18 months or so, when artists and musicians, etc., have been prevented from performing or having incidents during their performance. When you say what was life like, my mother was a student at the Vienna Conservatorium, and her teacher was a very well-known piano teacher. She gave that up. I'm not sure why or what happened. I presume when she got married or before that, she gave that career up. But she was always very much into the arts. I'm amazed at the knowledge that she had of literature. When I was doing Shakespeare or studying Shakespeare, in fact, she gave me Shakespeare's collected works when I was about 12, because she knew them. She had studied them in German translations. So that was the sort of person she was, and she was into philosophy and people's writings. So she was a musician, if you like, but she certainly went to concerts. And she recalls an instance, not sure when it probably was about 1937, so before the Anschluss, because she wouldn't have been going to the concerts after that. Bruno Walter, who was a Jewish conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, I think it was conducting a performance, and the Nazi hooligans came into the auditorium and let off stink bombs. The audience left. He tried to continue conducting. Most of the orchestra left. He was soon replaced by a Nazi. I'll call him a Nazi conductor. So that was going on in the 30s. My mother went through all of that. So as I tell my story, I guess my mother's personality will come through. Yeah, so my brother was born in 1927. They had another child in 1937, so 10 years later. They'd established their little business, I guess, but they lost that baby, and she was devastated. She's written about that. She was totally devastated. I think it was in about September 37. The Anschluss occurred in March 38. And she writes, whether this is correct or not, but she was so upset and so that her doctor advised her to become pregnant again, which is a bit strange to me, but she did.
So you were the medicine prescribed.
Well, it sounds like that. Yeah, it does. But also, I may also have been the cause of tragedy. She lost her father in 1934. She lost a baby in 1937. They were building up their business. The Anschluss happened, and they decided to get out. Now, the idea was that they would try and get to England. Now, that meant getting out of Austria into Belgium, actually going into Germany. And my parents did that with their 11-year-old son, and that involved travelling at night, crossing two borders where there would be border guards. In fact, there were border guards even on the Belgian side, but they had to try and avoid them, bribing people, paying for people, climbing through and under barbed wire fences. A horrendous experience. And you've got an 11-year-old child with you, and what do you take with you when you leave a situation like home? What are the valuables, or what do you carry? What can you carry if you're doing that sort of stuff? Unfortunately, I was never able to discuss that with her. In retrospect, I wish I had. So anyway, they made it to Brussels. And again, coming to another country, the education system in Austria was pretty good. As far as I could tell, they could speak French enough to communicate. And I have evidence from the way they wrote later that their French was incredibly good. But they got to Brussels, found an apartment, I think, managed to find work. Some stage, I think in late 38 or early 39, my father had an appendicitis operation, had to go to hospital, going to hospital in a foreign country. They had to cope with all of that. But I was born in 1939, January 1939, which meant that this trip from Austria to Belgium, my mother was pregnant at the time. I can't envisage how she was able to do all that. She got work at various times and so on, but she actually writes in my brother's journal something which is quite moving, because it's a question that she is subsequently asked too. But she writes in that she didn't notify her family back in Vienna that she was pregnant. She didn't want. She knew what they were going through. That's why they left. But she didn't want to alarm them further, and she didn't want to face their criticism that she had become pregnant. But right towards the end of the pregnancy, she does let them know, and she hopes that they understand what her motive was. And it's strange to read that someone should have a motive to become pregnant or to have a child. But then later she writes to my brother in the journal, to his journal. It's something like, when you grow up, you may ask, how could I do this? Mum, how could you become pregnant at a time like that? And she answers, precisely at such time. Should we give our enemies the satisfaction that they have got on top of us? No, that is the time to become pregnant or to have another child. And it's interesting because my wife, many years later, and they got on extremely well. The only argument, or sort of argument they had, was when my wife asked that sort of question. And her answer then, many years later, was out of defiance. And my wife said, oh, come on, Mum, really. And has forever felt guilty about her attitude, because reading when we subsequently wrote what my mum had, read what my mum had actually written, my wife was quite astounded and felt guilty that she should question it. But that was my mother. She was motivated. My brother, as I said, they left when they were 11, and then he had to then grow up during the war, and his education was prevented. He spent maybe a year or so in school in Belgium, and then got work in a photographer's darkroom, probably as safe a place for a Jew to be during the war. But fascinatingly, when German soldiers came into the photographer's studio to have their films developed, the boss, the photographer, couldn't speak German, so he would call Herbie out of the darkroom to translate. Now, that was crazy for my brother, really, because, the German soldiers would say, well, how come this 14-year-old kid can speak German? Knowing my brother, he would have spoken with a French accent. And they were the sort of strategies that one had to have to survive in that time.
It's an incredible story, even just so far, Jack. But when you've moved, or your parents and your brother had moved to Belgium, and they're now there finding work and getting on with things as best as they can, is there anything defining about them that makes them Jewish? Were they religious? Were they identifiable by something by that stage in their passport or papers? Or can you tell me about that?
I don't know exactly how they treated themselves or how they were treated, but they had to have false papers. But my grandmother managed to get out from Vienna also, and she joined us. So it then became a grandmother, mother, father, and my brother and I. My grandmother was certainly religious. She came from a religious family. It was not there was no organised Jewish existence, I don't think. Whether there was a synagogue. I mean, we're talking about a very brief period of time, really, 39, 40, after that things changed completely. But yes, my grandmother was certainly a religious person. And I have said to a couple of rabbis, and it's probably a rude thing to say to a rabbi, but I've said that the most religious person I've ever come across is my grandmother, because she was just the epitome of goodness. She was just a beautiful person. Life back in Vienna, she was known as somebody she was a magnificent pastry cook, as many Viennese were. She would bake extra for people, and they would know, poor people, and they would come and she would give them. Then we can talk about that later, but when we came to Australia, she insisted on always giving a donation before New Year, before Rosh Hashanah, to the welfare society here for Jewish people who needed help, who needed financial support. That was just her, it was bred into her. Perhaps as we talk further on, there'll be an incident where I can perhaps highlight how she perhaps saved our lives. In early 1940, the Belgians were worried about a German fifth column, that there would be Germans sent in advance to countries to facilitate their movement into the country. They were worried about the German fifth column, and they ordered all able-bodied men up to a certain age, I think about 40 or so, to report to a government office, which my father did. And I read in what Mum wrote again of her accompanying him by tram to the office and them saying goodbye, certainly not knowing what would happen, but uncertain about whether she would see him again, because they were then sent off to France to, can't call them concentration camps, I don't think, but certainly camps, and there were a number of camps right throughout France. I think the Belgians and French must have done some sort of deal to take these people, Germans, and not differentiating whether they were Jews or not. And I sort of wonder, couldn't the Belgian authorities and the French authorities have done more to save Jews? But obviously they didn't. So my father finishes up in France, where he is for nearly 2.5 years, moving from different camps And I have correspondence from him to my mother back in Belgium. Perhaps I could read a couple of things that he writes, because I have that correspondence. Now, this is written from Drancy. Now, Drancy was really a transit camp. From the various camps, they moved them to Drancy at various times to ship them off, to Auschwitz. And he had arrived in Drancy, and he writes this on 25th of October. My dearest friends, I hope that you've received my letter from Moeverstalds, which was another camp, and I inform you that I am well. I have been here for 3 days and do not know when we will leave. I'm together with my friend Lewin, as well as many others, men and women. I have the hope to be able to beat everything and that we will all see each other again in the not-too-distant future. Till then, you will have to stay strong, both physically and morally. It is possible that I will not be able to write to you regularly and beg you not to worry. I promise you that I will do my best to stay in good health. On your side, do not lose your courage. Think always of me as I would always think of you. 1,000 kisses, Richard. And at the bottom he writes, answer me by return mail. Which my mother did, but he never got that letter, because he writes again then on the 5th of November, so a few days later, having not heard from my mother, my dearest friends, a moment before the departure, I'm sending you my last greetings. I'm well and have confidence in the future. May God protect you. Stay strong, my very dearest, and never forget that my thoughts will forever be near you. The distance, however great, could never separate us. Most important, stay well and do not forget your father, who embraces you and clutches you to his heart. With all my tenderness, Richard. I have the letter which my mother wrote, which she never got. And it's quite a fascinating historical document, because it's like a letter card that opens up, and the outside of it has been taped over, and the word geöffnet is in it, so the German word meaning opened, so it was opened by German authorities. In French, it also has indications that the French censors opened it. And then in handwriting is retourné. Oh, I think it's retourné, meaning returned or left. So basically what, now you would say left this address. Imagine what my mother felt when she got that, knowing that he had not received those final words of hers. Pretty tragic, I think, but she had to manage all that.
When I was listening to you read that, and thank you so much for bringing that in, because it's something that you don't get to, this particular letter not get to experience.
And it's live.
But it's live. As you said, it was from the time and all that raw emotion, but also the courage of your father to keep that hope and optimism and try to keep the calm for his family. And I'm trying to think, as a dad of a 4 and 3-year-old, what emotions would be going through my mind writing that and knowing I might not see them again, most likely, and remember your father, like the embrace, and it just it can bring you to breakdown points. With tears,
it's often difficult for me to read it.
Yeah.
So as you'll have understood, he left in 1940. I didn't know him. I was about 15 months old, so I never knew him. And I've got to know him through those couple of letters. He writes, I'm well. They were treated pretty badly in those camps in France. There was somebody who lived in our street in Belgium. In fact, I talked about my grandmother baking things. Now, there were food shortages, how she managed to eke out food for us, I don't know. But she baked cakes. I can't understand it. But my brother relates, he has written about this, of taking a cake to a married couple hidden up in an attic in our street. And this guy had also gone to France. He got married just prior to this, and he just was determined to see his wife and somehow escaped and got back to Brussels. He's quite a famous painter, and his work is celebrated in Germany. And he has painted or drawn paintings of the people in those camps in France, and they're emaciated. And my father writes, "I'm well," just to not depress my mother too much.
And so from this point,
yeah,
for your father, you mentioned Auschwitz.
He went to Auschwitz, and we never saw him again, so I never knew him. As I said perhaps earlier, that my grandmother and her two sons and the other daughter and her husband, they all managed to get out of, and a number of other relatives, all managed to get out of Austria in late 1938 or early 1939. I just sort of passed over 1938, forgetting that in November 1938 was Kristallnacht. And again, my mother writes about Kristallnacht, and she actually says that it was all a setup because and she writes about a Jewish man in Paris shooting a minor German diplomat, and overnight Kristallnacht happens. Now, it happened all over Germany and Austria, and overnight they were ready for it. And my mother actually writes they were looking for an excuse. And I find that quite astounding because, I mean, this is the days before internet or mobile phones, or maybe they had a radio, but somehow they kept up with what was going on in late 1938 in Belgium. So the rest of the family got out of Vienna, and my grandmother joined us. The rest of them all managed to get to England. And this would have been early 1939. Because interestingly, I have my mother's passport when she left in June 1938, and it's an Österreichisches passport, an Austrian passport. I have my grandmother's passport in February 1939, and it's German, Deutsches passport. So in that time, the bureaucracy moved very quickly, and they produced their own passports and altered. Now, in my grandmother's passport, even though she got the passport in basically Nazi Vienna, it seems strange that they would have issued passports at that time, but it was Judenraus, so they gave them passports. But there's a red J on the top of the passport. And I wondered why they would do that. They give them passports to get out, but they still put a red J on, Jew. And I presumed that policy was Judenraus. Probably they had decided that they would chase them up subsequently, and this would be an easy way of identifying them. But I've heard that there was a deal made with Switzerland about that to prevent people escaping into Switzerland. In fact, when my father was in France, he tried to do that and was caught on the border and sent back into the camps in France. Yeah, so that's interesting. So the others got out and managed to get to England. We were the first to get out, and we didn't. And I often wonder if that was because I was a baby and there was no way of them getting to England carrying a small baby. And, of course, had I not been there, they would have, and my father would have been alive. Now, it's not that I feel guilty about it, but the thought goes through my mind, had I not been born, they would have got to England. They were the first to leave Vienna.
Although there were many, many that did stay in Belgium thinking we're not in Germany.
But the rest of the family got out.
Yeah.
All of them. All of them. They all went to England. And again, then there's a story there about them in England. My sister's two brothers, I've mentioned them before, they did get to England, but the Brits interned them after the war started and shipped them out, Germans. And again, they didn't differentiate between Nazis, if you like, or Germans and Jews. They were, I think Churchill was asked about that and he said, ship them all out. And 3 ships left England, bound for Canada. One of the ships was torpedoed off the coast of Italy, and there were lots of lives lost, but many did survive and were sent back to England and then shipped out a second time on the Dunera. And that's an interesting story for Australia, because that's a ship that came to Australia which carried a whole lot of Austrian and German intellectuals of the highest level, and who were important for the development of Australia later on in the arts and in business and in culture and in academia. And those 2 uncles were on the Dunera. So my story is Kindertransport, Auschwitz and Dunera in the one family.
Yeah.
Again, this is something I'm not clear about, because my father was left us in early 1940, and my mother decided to continue trying to get to England. So the 4 of us, grandmother, mother and brother and I, attempted that, which meant sort of walking, travelling, hiking, getting lifts through Belgium in an attempt to get to Dunkirk, where a ship might have taken them to England. They got almost there. I think they got to the border of Belgium and France, but the Germans beat them to it, and there was no longer the possibility of getting a boat from Dunkirk, so they walked and whatever back to Belgium again. Again, you know, what do you take with you in a situation like that? With a baby, and what my mother managed to achieve is just, I just can't fathom it. She does write, or some memory of her being able to convince a farmer to let them stay in his hayloft, getting milk to feed me, and so on. So anyway, they finished back in Belgium, and that's where we survived the war. How that happened is really quite remarkable, and there were people involved, which I'd like to mention, because people who did incredible things for Jews during the war, or many of them, some of them really, have been recognised as righteous amongst the nations, recognised at Yad Vashem, and we know the names of Wallenberg, etc. But there are so many other unnamed people, far more, who did little things to save Jews, who, out of humanity, saved these poor people. And some of them are in my story. And I highlight that when I speak about this. I highlight them because there's something that every individual can do whenever, in any circumstance, when they see somebody in trouble. And I think that's a lesson to all of us. First of all, it was obligatory under the law to inform the presence of a Jew. Now, of course, and in Belgium, by then, the Germans had occupied Belgium, and that was easy because the Belgians capitulated. They'd been through the First World War. They didn't want the hassle or the trauma of a war. They just capitulated to the Germans, which meant that any German army was not, in Belgium, was not basically fighting a war. They had other duties as soldiers. You're obliged to notify people, and a few instances now that I'll mention are people who didn't do that but showed the humanity that I was talking about before. My grandmother looked after us during the war. My mother was working, my brother was working, I was a small child. As she looked after us, cooking, etc., and shopping. Now, she couldn't speak French, but when she went to shop, the shopkeepers must have realised that she was at least German, but probably that she was Jewish, assumed they didn't report us. It was a time of food shortage during the war. One had to get food coupons regularly, I think monthly, by going to a government office, presenting your carte d'identité, your identity card, and you would then be provided with your food coupons for the month. The carte d'identité had a little photo on it, like like we have now on our driver's licenses or on our passports. And my mother handed in her card, and it took quite some time on this occasion to get her card back with the coupons. And when she looked around the office, she saw that something was being handed on from one employee to another, and they were all laughing. When she got her card back, some funny individual had painted a little moustache on her photo and a little beard, making her look like a Jewish man. That was the cause of the laughter. Now, even though they laughed about it and they knew about it, and clearly they knew then that she was Jewish, presumably they didn't report us either. And then there's an incident where we lived on the third floor of an apartment building, and if the doorbell rang downstairs, which would be on the street, on the footpath, the entry, we could look down from our apartment and see who was there. One morning the doorbell rang, my mother looked down, and there was a German officer standing there. She feared the worst, and she was wearing a necklace, which she took off, and she had a little bit of money in her purse. She put it in my hand and pushed me into I was probably aged about 4, I think, pushed me into a little sort of a cubby hole and shut the door. She was fearing the worst because this German was there and thought she would save me by doing that. And my brother had by then gone to work, and she assumed, she thought that, well, he'll find me there. She had to let him in, and I screamed my head off. And that's interesting because, you know, we all wonder sometimes what our first memory is, and that's my first memory of anything, in that cubbyhole. And then sitting on my mother's knee and watching him, and he intimated that for a consideration, he would cross us off his list. He had a list, which I still remember seeing, which he put on the table. And my mother said, well, all I have is what the child's clutching in his hand. He saw the necklace, took it, put it in his pocket, presumably to give to a girlfriend or something that evening. And I remember seeing him crossing us off his list. And he said he'd cross us off the list and report to his superiors that there were no longer Jews living at this address. So that was his job. He was injured. I always thought that he had lost an arm. But my brother wrote a history of what had happened, and he writes that he had an injured leg, and that was why my mother was able to let him in and rush upstairs and try to hide me before he could join us. I don't know if that's all true. But I question his motivation. Was he just a lone wolf going around getting bits of jewellery or money from Jews? Was he in fact a decent person who maybe he was a religious person? And I talked about my grandmother earlier. She would pray every morning, and when he came up, she had a prayer book in her hand and was standing up praying. Obviously thinking also, is this the end, perhaps? Did he take pity on her? Did she influence him in any way? But the fact is that he did cross us off his list. We didn't trust him, or Mum didn't trust him, and we left the apartment that night. She watched to see if anything would happen over the next few days. Nothing seemed to happen, and we moved back in. Sometime later, quite a bit later, I think, because I think this was probably about 6 weeks before the end of the war, and the Germans had lost the war, but they were still busily rounding up Jews. The doorbell rang one evening, and there's a woman standing there, and when Mum let her in, she said that she'd been there in the morning, but nobody answered the doorbell. I presume my mother had gone to work, my brother had gone to work, and grandmother, maybe she wasn't home, or she didn't hear the doorbell. She was working for the Belgian underground, resistance people working against the German occupation. She was working in the post office, and when letters were addressed to the Gestapo, the German police, Nazi police, rather than just Germans. These were the baddies, the real Gestapo. When letters were addressed to them, they would try and open them because there might be something of interest to them, their work, or that they could use. But when the presence of a Jew was being reported, and that did happen, that people sent, maybe anonymously, letters, or maybe they got paid to report a Jew. When they found something like that, they would try and warn them, and that's why this woman tried so hard to come and warn us. Of course, she didn't identify herself, which is quite, in one way, it's understandable because it was too dangerous to do that. But again, here's an anonymous person who should have been recognised as a righteous, who hasn't. She told us that we had 3 or 4 days to get out because they would steam the letters open, see what's in them, and had to reseal them in order to avoid their work being caught. And we had a few days to get out, but we got out that night. Again, that's a very strong memory of leaving in the middle of the night, and there was a curfew. How dangerous was that? But Mum was so worried that something could happen the next day that we took the chance and left during the middle of the night, 4 of us walking in the street to somewhere.
That somewhere, was it known?
No, that I said that we left when the German officer came, and we went somewhere, and again this time, and it was to a woman, and I don't know how Mum knew her. I had a feeling that they may have met during this sojourn in Belgium, when maybe this woman was also trying to get to England or something. Mum had made her acquaintance, and the woman said, if ever you're in trouble, come to my place, which we did, and we survived the rest of the 6 weeks in her apartment. She was never recognised for what she did. And when we came back to the apartment after the war, indeed, the apartment had been raided. There were stickers all over the door. The lock was sealed with the swastika stickers, and obviously they'd been inside and didn't find us. So that's how really we survived the war.
So that last 6 weeks, is this at the time of liberation of Belgium?
Well, the liberation came, yes, at the end of 6 weeks, I guess, and that's certainly a strong memory.
Yeah.
During the war, I remember the searchlights every night towards the end of the war, roaming the skies, and bombing going on. But that bombing was Allied bombing of Belgium by the Allies. So you learned to live with that. But I remember walking one morning after there'd been a bombing the night before, still seeing the smoking buildings. So you remember those things. The other memory also, and I'm occasionally reminded here when I hear a siren, and I'm not sure whether it's an ambulance siren or a fire brigade siren, but a very similar siren to the ones that the Nazis used, the Gestapo used in rounding up Jews. You would hear the siren coming, and you knew that they were on their way again to pick up Jews. And you would always, you'd hear it approach, and you'd always wonder, are they going to stop here? And you'd be so relieved when it faded into the distance, as obviously they were after somebody else. Relieved, but then, what happened to the people they were picking up? And of course, the people in the post office who knew what was going on. I said she didn't reveal her name, but how dangerous was what they were doing if they were caught? So she may well have suffered the fate that she saved us from. Stories of survival. I mentioned my brothers speaking German, I'm sure, with a French accent. I remember one time I went to a park with my grandmother, and I was kicking a soccer ball, and I kicked it a bit too far, and there was a German soldier just walking up and down the park, and he stopped the ball and he spoke to me in German. Of course I understood what he said. I made out as if I couldn't understand. I then went back to my grandmother. She was sitting on a park bench, and I spoke to her in French, which she couldn't understand. I spoke to her in French while he was within earshot. how does a 4, 5 year, I don't know how old I was, how do you learn those skills? And only 2 days ago, my niece, as it's my brother's daughter, related that he had told her that when he walked with me, if there was a German soldier anywhere nearby, I was not to speak in German. So I learned over the last couple of days where I got that from. Speaking of my brother, as I said, I never knew my father. I was 15 months or so when he left. This 13, 14-year-old boy became my foster father or Ersatzfather, if you like. And I read again what my mother wrote. She basically writes at one stage, if I am no longer there, and I don't know exactly what she meant, but she says whether she meant in due course or imminently, if I'm no longer there, that he was to look after me.
Incredible. And what I love about the way that you tell the story, Jack, is that you honour all of those people along the way that helped that survival, but don't diminish the amazing bravery and courage and will that your mother and grandmother and even you as a child and your brother had as well.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. We survived. And again, the other traumas that they went through, not really knowing what had happened to her two brothers. At some stage, she probably found out that they were shipped to Australia. So some relief there. But then the anxiety that those two boys had when they were here, knowing that their sister and mother and the sister's two boys were in Europe. And I don't know how long mail took, but probably 6, 8, 10 weeks before you got any communication back, and then not getting a letter back for a long time, not knowing what had happened. So they went through quite a lot here, having been on the Danira, which was a horrific experience for them. Incidentally, perhaps their story is interesting too. As I said, they were on the Danira. One of the uncles had been engaged in Vienna, and as I understand it, the engagement broke up. His fiancée managed to get to Australia, I think sometime in 1939, it must be. She managed to get a visa to Australia. It was not so easy to get visas at all, and then at some stage it was stopped altogether. But she managed to get to Australia as a working girl, as a domestic. This woman was really a really talented pianist. I don't think she'd lifted up a rag to clean her place at home, but she got to work in Australia. Somehow or other, she must have kept in touch with her former, as I understand, former fiancé, and found out that he'd come to Australia. And the two boys, the two men had a tannery business, which was an essential industry in Australia during the war. People were able to get out from the camps here, from the Danira. They went through Hay, New South Wales. Again, some of these people were the most educated and elite people of Viennese and German society, and coming to Australia. Safety, but the heat of Hay, New South Wales must have been horrible for them. And they were interned behind barbed wire with Australian soldiers guarding them. Then they were many of them were transferred to Victoria, to Tatura, and my two uncles were there. The fiancé of the one, or the ex-fiancé, managed to get work for him here with a tannery business. And as it was essential war service, he was able to get out, and they subsequently did marry. The other brother, he was most unhappy here. He was very, very sick. And the whole Danira story was a scandal in that England convinced the Australians to take these people. The Australians thought they were taking war criminals, or not war criminals, but captured enemy soldiers or whatever. And it was a scandal, and the British Parliament or government relented and said that anybody who wanted to go back could, and quite a number did, including this other uncle of mine. We were never sure why. He was certainly unhappy here. He wasn't able to be released the way the other brother was. But I do have a letter of his, and it's quite tragic. He makes one attempt to go back, and he becomes very sick off the coast of Western Australia. He must have been off on his way back on a ship, and he gets sent back to Australia because he was so sick, and he gets sent back to Sydney again. He then somehow makes his way out of Australia again. But he leaves a letter at the British consulate or somewhere in Sydney saying to be opened only in the case of my death. And in that letter he opens up a little, and it seems that he had a girlfriend or something in England and was determined to go back. He goes back and the ship is torpedoed off the coast of England, and he drowns, having had 2 trips care of His Majesty's service backwards and forwards during wartime. Tragic things happen.
Tragic, but it was for love. We
think so. We think so. Or I think he was quite depressed.
Yeah.
He couldn't see a life in Australia, maybe. I mean, the other way of getting out was to join the Australian Army. For some reason or other, that was his fate. Now, after the war, my grandmother found out that the brother and son had perished.
Jack, can you now, I guess, tell the story of you coming to Australia and with your brother, grandmother and mother?
Yeah. There's some interesting episodes that I recall. The uncle that was here, he sponsored us. That's how we were able to get out. We arrived here in March 1948, and it becoming increasingly difficult to get visas to Australia. And there's another story there that there were so many escaped Nazis who managed to get to Australia. Visas were somehow provided for them, but it's another story. But anyway, we got here because of my uncle, and he managed to rent a little house for us near where he lived in Middle Park. And I started going to school. So March, April, I started going to school, not speaking a word of English. I learned pretty quickly. I recall in those days, I went to school in Belgium for a couple of years till we left, and I remember when I came here they put me down one class, but during that year they moved me back up to the right class. I'd learned pretty quickly. I remember when my first day, in those days, I don't know if this still happens now, but in those days kids had to do dictation, and I think I got every word wrong. And I think a month later I got most of the words right. And I mention that because I was the only migrant in Middle Park State School, in my class anyway. And I had a teacher who provided me with a picture book that had the French word with the English word. My mother was insistent that I learnt, and that's another part of my mother. I mean, as I said, she was pretty educated in Vienna, but education was everything for her. My brother's education was lost. He spent maybe a year at school in Belgium and then went to work. So he didn't have an education, but he was a bright guy and he could have achieved so much. And he did in his own profession here. Incidentally, as I said, he worked in a photographer's darkroom in Belgium and became a well-known photographer here in Melbourne.
Oh, wow.
So he got his training there. But Mum, I think, saw the future, and when I say the future, she means the future not just of me and the family, but of the Jewish people, that I had to survive, that I had not survive but achieve. That was the important thing, and that guided her life until, in fact, I did, and thereafter. But so I went to school here. Somehow or other, I don't know, I think my uncle must have helped, but somehow or other, Mum managed to buy a house in October of that year. No, we came here with nothing, so I don't know. But in those days, I think loans were fairly easy to get. Interest rates were very low. Cost of housing was low, especially if you went to a suburb. I was going to say an outer suburb, West Brunswick was hardly outer, but in those days it was.
Is that where you bought in West Brunswick?
Yes, we bought in West Brunswick, a little two-bedroom weatherboard house. In fact, it had been part of a larger bit of land, which the owner subdivided into 3 houses, and then he kept the rest for himself, which was a large piece of land, and it bordered on the Moonee Ponds Creek, as did our place. And when the Moonee Ponds Creek flooded, we lost some of our land. Each time there was a flood, a little bit more would fall down. Now, so that was in October, and Mum decided, I guess, rather than me having to change schools again, that I would continue going back to Middle Park. Now, he's a 9-year-old travelling by bus and tram every morning by himself to Middle Park. You wouldn't let a 9-year-old do that now. And then in the start of the new year, in January, I started at Moonee Ponds Central. And here begins the tale of my allegiance to the Essendon Football Club. In those days, football was a suburban, it was warfare between suburbs. Being in Moonee Ponds Central, 1939 was a very, very special year in the history of the Essendon Football Club. A guy by the name of John Coleman started playing. He kicked 12 goals in his first match, 100 goals in the first season. Is the greatest football I've ever seen. So he was a hero. 1939, everybody talked about John Coleman. It must have been towards the end of 39 that the football club offered to give kids a junior pass. They had to produce something, a poem or something. And
39 before the war or 49?
No, I'm sorry, 49, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay, of course, no, I'm wrong.
No, so 1949 and you're a 10-year-old at this point?
I was, 10.
Yeah.
Yes, 10.
Moonee Ponds
10.
with Windy Hill up the road.
Windy Hill up the road, correct, yeah. So I composed a poem. It went something like this. Dick Reynolds is clever and fair. John Coleman flies high in the air. Bill Hutchison's speed makes Essendon lead, so the Bombers will win everywhere. I still remember it.
Oh, that's incredible.
And I won a junior pass to the Essendon Football Club, and I attended. It seems a frivolous story, but I attended many matches in 1940 now. 1950, I attended many games throughout Melbourne and, going to Richmond and Collingwood and Fitzroy, pretty dangerous. And I remember doing it, often on my own, sometimes with my brother. But you got involved in Australian society. It's interesting. I heard Kevin Sheedy speak at a meeting where he was guest speaker to awardees like AMs and OAMs, that sort of crowd, or that sort of audience. And he's introduced as this wonderful person in football. And he gets up and he says, look, this introduction about me in football, I'm more than about football. And it was at a time when there was a problem with integrating migrants coming to the country. And he said, if you recall, I saw what was happening to Anzac Day, diminishing attendances at Anzac Day. And I got together with the Collingwood Football Club, with the president there, and we thought that it would be a good idea to have an Anzac Day match between Essendon and Collingwood, and that has persisted ever since. I then saw problems with the Indigenous people in this country, and I thought I had to do something about that. And I went to the Richmond Football Club, and that's how the Indigenous round started. The trouble with farmers, they were having a tough time. I went to Geelong Football Club and we arranged to have things outside the MCG to boost the farmers' hard lives. And you know what I would do now? There's a problem with migration. I would go to the ships. I think he said ships, but I think most people come by by plane now. I would go there and hand everybody a membership to a football club. That's the best way of indoctrinating them into the country. It's interesting what sport can do, because I remember we were already living in our house, so it must have been in 1949. No, it was probably still living before we moved, 1948, a test between England and Australia, in England, 1948, and listening on a wireless to a broadcast. Well, my brother was, so if he was listening, I was listening. Listening to a broadcast of the match. Well, it wasn't really a broadcast. It was a simulated broadcast because there wasn't live broadcast, but they were getting what was happening somehow, and they would make a noise of, oh, he's just hit another 4. So I learnt about cricket within 3 or 4 months of arriving here. No, having never seen a game, not knowing what it was all about. But that's how you became integrated into Australian society. And it stood me in good stead, I think.
So is it safe to say that you felt Australian pretty soon after arriving?
Well, yes. Yeah. Yes, I did. I mean, I was then in 1949 when I started school at Moonee Pond Central. That was in 5th grade. And I remember that myself and a girl would go out of religious instruction classes. So my mother must have gone to the school and said, I don't want him to be involved in the Christian religious instruction classes. And the school was comfortable with that. So obviously I knew I was different. And the kids knew I was different. But I don't remember any problems about that. It was accepted. The kids accepted that. Although I became extremely friendly with one boy, in fact, so much so that later on I was best man at his wedding. I haven't lost touch with him, but in recent times, his wife told me, he'd never told me. I became really friendly with him. His parents looked after me. They took me away on their holidays with them. I remember catching my first fish, and one of the few fish I ever caught was when I was away with them in Anglesey. But his wife told me in recent years, you know, Jack, Ian looked after you at school. I said, what do you mean? So, well, when you first came, that was in 5th grade, Ian was told to look after you. Someone at the school, the principal at the school said, look after this kid. And he did. You know, there'd be fights in the schoolyard. He was my bodyguard, if you like. I never knew that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And to for the friendship to flourish, though, from protector to equal and friend. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Is life for you at this point, you know, being taken from Christian instruction, but was there a Jewish component to your life
only at home.
Yep.
Through my grandmother and my mother. My mothers, both of them. Even in Belgium, my grandmother tried to teach me Hebrew prayers. I can't read Hebrew, really. I sort of can follow when it's being read. I can follow it, but I didn't learn it. But my grandmother really tried, and the basic prayers, she would sit with me and instruct me. So, and at home, we didn't strictly keep kosher. We didn't necessarily keep the dietary laws, but every Jewish person does more or less, like any religious people. Some do more than others. The high holidays, the important holidays, were certainly kept, and we went to synagogue on the high holidays, and certainly kept. My grandmother insisted on keeping Pesach quite strictly, different dishes, the whole thing. But during the year, not so much. We did have non-kosher meat. Again, though, on special holidays, we would make sure to buy. It wasn't so easy in Australia to get kosher meat, but yes, we did. So yes, Jewish life, and my brother mixed in Jewish circles. When we came to Australia, he was 21. Well, I was 9 when we arrived here and went to school, but at the age of 12 or 12 and a half or so, was getting close to me being 13, Jewish boy, bar mitzvah. And I had to learn the bar mitzvah. So that became more of an issue. It was not easy either, but Mum always made sure that happened. Just talking about Mum again, she got work the moment she arrived in Australia. There was a German factory, Bosch, which are quite notorious Nazis, but they were here, and because she could speak German, she got work there. So they were obviously prepared to, they would have known she was Jewish, they were prepared to employ a Jewish lady. I think she got some expertise in bookkeeping.
Wow, yeah. Bosch.
Yeah.
But it is interesting how things change.
Yes.
From camps and Gestapo sirens
Yes.
and death around any corner, speaking with the wrong accent at the wrong time, to moving to Australia. And as you said, Bosch is here, but you said that also there wasn't a problem with ex-Nazis being given passports potentially and maybe working in that same factory.
Yes.
And there's everyone together in Australia, and things just change on a
Yes,
dime like
yes.
that. But obviously not the memories. And on that note, what was it like for your grandmother and mother especially, and maybe even your older brother, as old, you're a child and everything's brand new, and I'm sure you've got your own experiences too, but did you notice a way that they held themselves or were like in life that, I mean, positive or negative based on these experiences?
Yeah, no, they were positive. As I said before, I regarded my grandmother as the most religious person. Her contact with people was emblematic of what she was like. By that time, when we came here, her hearing began to go, and she couldn't speak English. Although there's a funny story. I recall on the ship coming out here, by the way, on the ship coming out here, I got measles, which was pretty serious in those days, or still is really, but it was pretty serious. But anyway, on the ship, I recall her with an English book, trying to learn English at the age of 74 or something. Now, when I went to school here, this was again in middle 48, soon after we arrived, I think she found how nice biscuits were. I think they were thin captains, those round, those oval-shaped biscuits. And she sent me out to buy biscuits. And she said, in German, get the dry biscuits. Now, clever kid that I was, I could already speak English after. I thought, she means 3, because dry in German is 3. And I thought she meant 3. So I go to the grocer and I say, I wanted to buy 3 biscuits. And he looks at me, says, what are you talking about, kid? Well, I said 3 biscuits, because I had translated. So, look, I clearly I couldn't speak English well, but I don't remember it being a major problem. I integrated fairly quickly, I think. It was okay. And my grandmother, whoever got to know her, accepted her, like I think the shopkeepers in Belgium did. Just that personality came through. Mum, no, she did well here. I mean, everyone accepted her. I don't recall a problem with her, and she subsequently got work. Actually, that reminds me, at one stage she was managing a tiny little cubby hole. It was the entrance to a shop. On one side of the entry was a tobacconist, and on the other side was this tiny little space where she was running a little jewellery business. And then subsequently, I think that business closed and she moved around the corner. This was in Burke Street, actually, and she moved around the corner into Russell Street. Now talking 1956, she's working in a jewellery shop. The lady was also Jewish in Russell Street. And some German athletes came into the shop and threatened the lady, tried to bargain, I think, and she wouldn't give in, and he pulled out a knife. This is a German athlete here
for the
Olympics. 1956 for the Olympics, and he has a knife on his, and he holds it to her, and she won't give in. And he says, "You're frightened," in German. And she says, "No. But you were frightened once, weren't you?" So this is a young athlete, I don't know how, say he was 20, he was a small child during the war, but he knew. You were frightened once, weren't you?
Wow.
So, I think, look, that's probably isolated incidents, but
that
they
existed.
happen. They happen.
As we said, it wasn't just this automatic, instantly forget prejudice or the past.
And we often say when if not anymore now, but if you met a German, I remember meeting someone on a traveller German and got on well. And sort of the thought went through your head, what did Daddy do? What was Daddy doing during the war? It's unavoidable, I think.
I do have an interesting story where a German staff member here at Bialik, who's doesn't work here now, but we were at a Kabbalat Shabbat, in the amphitheatre, and it was lovely. It was really moving. It was special. She was crying, and I said to her, "Are you okay?" And she's like, "I just see the beautiful kids sitting here and how wonderful it is and how special, and then think of what my country did, And so you do... There's that trauma, the opposite of it too.
Well, yes, there's enormous guilt. I think maybe it's beginning to go now. But I remember meeting a German guy in the plane one time. He was in his late 40s. He was saying, look, I'm getting a little bit sick of being blamed for what my father or grandfather did.
At one point, when does it change? I guess Australia's history is very similar, not similar, but, has a legacy of... guilt.
Well, yes. I mean, why should we 200 years later have to feel guilt?
Yeah.
And especially, I mean, all of us are migrants, and we're made to feel guilt.
Actually, my daughter the other day, who's 4, she said that the Aboriginal people were here first, and then the white people came, and she goes, and they took the land without permission, but... That's not us because we came later. And we're Italian background. And I'm like, wow, I just didn't know how to respond to a 4-year-old saying that. Sure. And I just said, look, that's right. There were people here and they were here and people did come and claim that land as their own. And many of them without choice, convicts and things like that. But then we do live here and we try to live in harmony based on sometimes the wrongs done in the past that we get the benefits of. So I was trying to say, don't feel guilty, but understand the past somehow. But it's a 4-year-old.
But that's the history of the world, isn't it? There's been invasions and occupations and everywhere. Every country has had it.
Yeah.
And it changes.
That's right. You can't forget that. No matter what.
My mother, just to talk about her a little more. She was a student at the Vienna Conservatorium, and somehow that finished. She comes to Australia and works, and as I said, her wish to see me succeed is just overwhelming. She, at the age of around about 65, she has to get new employment, but I think the retirement age was 65, so she puts her age back 5 years or so that she could get the job. And she stays there until she was actually the age of 72. Again, her employer just loved her. At the age of 72 or thereafter, she starts getting piano lessons again with actually a very famous piano teacher. The woman had been a student of Percy Granger, so she's no slouch, and Mum was able to get her as a teacher and starts learning piano again and going to the most enormous number of adult education classes and lectures. She used to always talk about these things, and it was always a bit philosophical, and we used to think, oh yes, Mum, she goes again sort of stuff. And I feel guilty about that because seeing what the breadth of things that she took on in her latter years was just amazing. There's an episode at a funeral. The Jewish custom is to shovel three shovelfuls of earth onto the coffin, and the sound of the earth hitting the wooden coffin is horrendous. It goes through each time. And my brother did his 3 shovelfuls, and then I did mine. And then the most enormous sense of anger just overwhelmed me. I'm not generally an angry person, but I almost viciously took a 4th shovelful and just threw it into the grave. And I turned to my brother, we were both crying. It's a very sad time, and yet I was angry. And I said, this is for the effing Germans. The reason for that was that I'm standing in front of her grave, and as is customary at the funeral, the funeral people put a piece of wood with the name on it. And I'm looking at that, and I'm seeing her name. Now, I had been married then probably about 30 years or something, so something of that order, happily married. And the thought came over me. She'd been married for about 14 years when my father was taken from her, and they then lived another 55 years without a partner. And I was just so angry because she'd been robbed of the life I was having. So, yeah, that's her story.
Well, thank you.
A remarkable woman, really.
Yeah, and thanks so much for sharing that and being open. But you mentioned, at the age of 72, beginning life again almost, and what she had been taken away. And I think for so many people, falling in a heap before that, let alone in your old age or later stages to begin again and to say, I'm going to do what was taken from me. Yes. And that's just unbelievable to be able to do that and realise, like, I don't have to live with that sense of that's been taken and it's gone. No, I'm going to reclaim this.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I speak to school kids and question time. I remember one time a boy, I think, said, did your mother ever hate, or did your mother hate? And, I was a bit thrown by that question, but it's remarkable that you can respond quickly, and I did. I said, no, she didn't have time. And that's exactly what you just said. She didn't have time. She had to get on with stuff. Mind you, the thought of my father was never away from her, and it did affect her. I remember one time she was getting older, and she'd been a bookkeeper and was great with figures, but, she got older, she started not being so good, and I had to do some of her bookwork and stuff for her, and I'd come and she'd have figures all over bits of paper. She obviously wasn't coping all that well. But you had to fill in a form, I think, each year or something for your pension and what your income was. She had anything really to worry about. And she was obsessed. She was so worried about it. And I said, Mum, what's your problem? What? She was worried that there'd be a knock on the door from the pension people. She had no reason to worry about it, but I think she had that thought, there'd be a knock on the door. Because she would have experienced that where we were living, even though they didn't knock on our door. We had Jewish people living upstairs, and they were taken from our building. She would have known that. She would have heard them coming up the stairs. Hard to forget that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, the legacy, I guess, from your grandmother and your mother and your father, who wasn't able to see it himself, but he was able to have 2 children, and those children two that were able to survive and live in Australia and after the war. An unbroken story, I guess, a story that was attempted to be taken and wasn't, lives on through you and then your kids too. What in your life are some of those achievements and things you're really proud of in your life?
I'll just say one thing about Mum. My wife's an academic. It's wrong to say she was envious, that my mother was envious, but she was proud of her daughter-in-law, very proud. But I think she expressed the fact that she was, I think that's more accurate. She expressed the fact that she didn't have the opportunity of doing what women were able to do now. A regret.
Yeah.
Well, I went to school here. I graduated. I became a doctor. I became a GP. When I graduated, that must have been one of the proudest moments of her life, and my grandmother's, and my brothers. Very proud. And then I practiced here and have lived a great life here. Married, had 2 kids. Are achieving incredibly well in both their professions. My son's a lawyer. My daughter's a doctor. She's a professor at university. We've had great opportunities here. It's been an incredibly wonderful country. But since October 7th, 2023, I've felt differently. I've not been threatened, but I hear of Jewish people who are threatened. I said the other day when I was speaking to some kids, they were girls from a Catholic school, I think, Catholic girls' school. And I don't normally wear, or I don't wear a kippah, a skull cap, normally, but I had one in my pocket. I set this up. I was thinking about it beforehand. I pulled out the kippah and I said, do any of you know what this is? And no one seemed to know, although I think they should have. I mean, the Pope wears one, but anyway. And I said, you probably vary in how religious each of you are, and so do Jewish people. But Jewish men, observant Jewish men, always wear this on their heads. I would not be prepared to wear this now in quite a few parts of Melbourne. And I think that's sad. What's going on in this country? A cousin of mine, or she's actually the daughter of the person I mentioned who was on the kinder transport. Again, she arrived here and had a daughter here. And this person's not really observant at all, not at all observant, and hasn't mixed particularly with Jewish things. She attends Pilates, and she's become friendly with a lady, a Greek woman, who said to her, Jan, I don't think I would be wearing that, referring to a Star of David necklace that she was wearing. I didn't know that she wore one. But she started wearing one since the events. And she said, why not? I'm proud. She said, oh, no, Jan, I'm worried about you being attacked. So here's this Greek lady aware of what's happening. That's not how we grew up here. When I went to school, by the way, to University High School. And it was convenient for me, especially at weekends, to study at the public library. Well, public library here these days, on a Sunday?
Yeah, you can't go there.
No.
I mean, even if you're not Jewish or it's just not a very pleasant place to be.
The streets have been taken over.
Yeah.
It's not right.
No. And as you say, the contribution you've given, your family's given, but not only that, but all Jewish people that have arrived.
And the grandchildren are on their way.
That's right. You know, and to suffer again, but because of a war happening on the other side of the world, first of all, I mean, there's so much that we can talk about in terms of the war itself, but how does that translate to an attack of Jewish people here?
Right, and that's exactly the point, and I think the seminal event was at the Opera House on October 9. I mean, I didn't talk so much about how the propaganda that the Nazis used in getting the people on side, but there's clear propaganda going on, and that's what worries me about what's going on. We don't need to talk about the Middle East, but that's what worries me about what's going on in Australia. How did they manage to get thousands of people on October 9 walking to the Opera House to attack Jews? Like on Kristallnacht, the Germans used an incident in the Middle East to attack Jews in Australia. Yeah. That's unbelievable, and governments have almost done nothing about that.
And that latent, as you said, Kristallnacht, how do they know after this shooting that everyone would rise up at once to destroy and burn and attack and kill? And how did they know on October 9th to... when the flag was there on the building to say, we're going to go there and overtake this. Like, it's there. Yeah. It's latent. And the thing is, it's now becoming mainstream.
Yes.
People that had no idea about anything prior, that wouldn't be anti-Semitic in their mindset or thought about it before, are now able to quote things that are Nazi adjacent in the language, and changing Jew to Zionist or whatever it might be. So it's pretty disturbing.
And they're conflating the Middle East thing with being Jewish. Yeah. I mean, I always regarded myself absolutely, and for one I've talked about football, etc. I mean, I can speak Australian like the best of them, and I get on very well. For example, I have a little to do with farmers. I get on really well with. It's not a problem with Australians. Mm-hmm. I regard me as a Jewish Australian, as anyone, a Christian Australian, Muslim Australian, whatever. Now, I'm an Australian Jew. There's a difference.
Yeah.
I feel different.
Yeah.
I'm another.
Yeah, and that's not from you; it's from what's being forced upon. Yeah,
and propaganda and it feeds on the ignorance. We had an incident a few months ago, not anti-Semitic at all. We were standing at a tram stop in Malvern, going into the city at about 10:15 in the morning, and the guy came, well dressed. Started speaking, well spoken, and he talked about his father had owned a shop across the road. He was an established Malvern citizen, and he was carrying a keffiyeh on his arm. He was going to a Sunday morning demonstration. Why? And if that's getting into mainstream Australia, it's a worry because that's how the Nazis were able to propagate their ideology.
And for many, it's mobilising hate through compassion.
Yes.
For some.
Yes.
It's like, this is horrible what's happening in warfare. Yes. And we're seeing images that we've never seen before due to social media and ubiquitous phone use and all of that. And for some people, it's like, that have never really looked into war in the past and things like that don't understand it, are seeing images that are confronting and saying, and then listening to the propaganda and conflating compassion for people in the Middle East, in Gaza, wherever it might be, including Israelis or whoever, conflating that with the propaganda they're hearing. Yeah. And that's where it becomes really scary, because you can actually see mainstream caring Australians starting to have hate in their hearts.
Well, yes. I mean, the incident recently of some school kids from Mount Scopus who go to the museum here and are confronted and called "you dirty Jew" by kids 2 or 3 years older than them. We're not talking about adults or anything. Kids who have got the idea of dirty Jew. I never heard that in my time. How come these kids are using that sort of language? Or knowing about gas ovens and these comments that are made by kids.
It's heartbreaking.
It's a worry.
It's a worry.
It's a worry.
It's not only heartbreaking, it's scary.
It's scary, Where is Australian society going? And the bulk of Australians aren't like that.
Yeah. And that's the middle Australia, the silent majority, we often hear. But silence, I guess, isn't enough anymore. People need to speak up.
In the presence of inaction from the politicians, it's a real worry.
Yeah. Jack, before I let you go, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with about, I guess, your life and experiences?
Yeah, look, as I said, I speak to school kids, and I'm asked that sort of question is a final message to the school kids. And I compartmentalise it to some extent, but they're overlapping. One of them is to watch out for people like Hitler. Now I'm not suggesting that this is going to happen here, but to watch out for the autocrats who try and bully you. And that raises the issue of bullying at school. Everyone can take action when there's bullying going on. So it brings it down to that level, and perhaps too much to bring it down from Hitler the bully to the bully in the schoolyard. But there is a similarity. How do you fight? How do you confront that? You don't take your life into your own hands, but what can you do about it? Can you report it to the school authorities? Can you pick up your mobile phone and notify the police? Or can you put your arm around the person who's being bullied? So I think that's an important message. The other one is about the righteous amongst the nations, or people like who are not recognised, like in my story. to stand up when you see something terrible happening. It's not quite the same as looking after the victim of the bully, but it overlaps it. But to be a good person, to have moral clarity, etc. And the last issue, as I've talked so much about my mother, is resilience. People can show resilience in different ways. You can, if you don't do as well in your school exams, or you don't get into the football team or the basketball team, or try again harder. I mean, my mother had so many problems in front of her, and she coped with them. It's actually interesting. This has gone through my mind in recent days. Why I do this? I sometimes ask the kids, why do you think I'm doing it? And I do it for those three reasons. And I've been doing it for some years, and I'm beginning to think, look, someone else can do it. I don't need to do it. And I was beginning to wane. And then after October 7, it became, an obligation to do it. And if I wasn't feeling so good about it, I'm getting older, I'd rather do something else. And I think of my mother's resilience. I've got to, no matter how hard it is, and it's not too hard, but it's sometimes hard speaking in front of an audience, or even speaking to the microphone like I do now. It's an obligation. I have something to tell. Hopefully the listeners get something out of what I'm saying.
Jack, amazing. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your story, your family's story, and for all you've done in Australia and you continue to do. And for your sake, I hope Essendon can lift their game.
I think we've got a few years to wait. And can I just say, I'm not exactly sure why you are doing this, but whatever reason, thank you for doing it. I think these histories need to be kept.
Thank you.
Their Stories Unbroken is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the founders of the Bialik community, who in 1942, a time of tragedy and horror for the Jewish people, and for so many others around the world, visioned and developed Bialik College as a new type of schooling for the youngest members of the Jewish community. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, follow, review and share. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can email theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. Thank you to Bialik College and all the staff behind the scenes that have helped make Their Stories Unbroken possible. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to the Bialik College Parents Association for their support in the podcast, as well as to musician Adam Starr. Additional thanks to Yad Vashem and the Gandalf Foundation. Please check out the show notes for links and any additional information. See you next time.